CJ who will be chairing this round. Judging with me is Vincent. Vincent, please introduce yourself as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Vinzen. My pronouns are he and him. Nice to meet you and good luck everyone.
All right, great. While waiting for the speaker positions of government, all right, all speaker positions are in. I think there's a question from one of the members of the ORGCOM. If both teams consent to being recorded, you can verbally answer it or like type your answer in the chat. Both is fine. All right, opposition consents. How about government? Do you consent to being recorded? Gov consents as well. So Khalil just inform me if the recording is up. And then I guess Prime Minister can start whenever everything's ready. Anyway, like we're debating the motion. This House believes that the 1% should be compelled to send their children to public schools. So PM, whenever you're ready, but I guess we must wait first for the, all right, it's already recording. All right, Prime Minister.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay. Wait, okay, my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, we, the government side, firmly believe that compelling the 1% to send their children to public schools is necessary step. It is necessary. So it is a step towards improving the state education in our country. Now, how we characterize this 1%? So we, the government side, ladies and gentlemen, the 1% in context refers to a randomly selected group of individuals from diverse backgrounds, income brackets, and professions. They are not only taxpayers, but also citizens who have responsibility to contribute to the betterment of society. Now, ladies and gentlemen, behind this motion, right, that is to create more inclusive and equitable education system by compelling the 1% to send their children to public schools, right? So this will not only improve the quality of education, but also increase the accountability, I'm sure, to the now address the problems present in the education system. Now, what is the problem, ladies and gentlemen? So the problem, the state is more incentivized to answer the problems present in the education system because uh, um because they have an image to fulfill, knowing that the fact that they have compel citizens give more pressure to the state that the citizens waive their choice, that makes the state accountable. So that the to address the problems in education system, the parents are not by compelling 1% to send their children to public schools, we can create more equitable and accountable education system. Now, what is the urgency of this debate, guys? So, the urgency lies in the need to improve the state education in our country. We cannot, by compelling 1% to send their children to the public schools, we can later take a significant step towards improving the quality in education and creating more equitable society. Now, what the point of context is that the principle delegated to the authorities with which states the state has the authority to make decisions in behalf of the citizens. Now, the second is the right of the choice of the children is not absolute, and the state has the responsibility to ensure that all citizens have access to quality education. Now, third is the assumption that all schools have met the educational standards, and those who have not will be closed. Now, the board to push the burden to the um on the opposition to defend the word of that where the 1% are not compelled to send their children to public schools and the state is not accountable for problems in the education system. Now, first argument is parents patriae. So it upholds principles that the parents patriae, which states that that the state is the parent of the society. It is the best interest of the state to cater the needs of constituents, namely in education. Later, so the motion also solidifies the basic human rights of citizens, including the right of education. Now, level one analysis is that it is highly likely to the state will take responsibility for the education of the citizens, and parents will be held accountable for their children education. Now, this debate is framed in a necessary step forwards in improving the state education in our country. So level two, guys, is that ladies and gentlemen, is that the extent of effect will be significant improvement in the quality of education and more equitable society. So the policy affect 1% of their children who will have an access to quality education. Now, the macro level is that we will have a positive impact in the education system and the society now as a whole. So what will be the worst case and best case scenario, ladies and gentlemen, in this? That the policy have minimal impact in education system, because we understand that we are sending 1% of the of the of, of the total population of children, right? So the best case in later, please. The policy will lead to a significant improvement in the quality of education for more equitable society. Argument number two is the social contract society, because we believe that the state and the state and the people have have the have this contract in which the state will give protection and serve the community if the people will give some of their rights to the state. So it is highly likely the state will take responsibility for education. Level one analysis is that it is highly likely that the state will take responsibility for the education for its citizens, and the parents will held accountable for their children's education. Now, the extent of this effect will significant improvement in quality education and more equitable society, because the policy will affect the 1% of the children who will have the access to quality the positive impact of the education system in the society as a whole. So now the principle of now the opposition might argue that this removes the autonomy towards the parents. However, this will not stand, because the right to choose of their children is not absolute, wherein it is still in the right of the child to exercise the right, and that would be all. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that speech. Just want to remind debaters to raise or like take POIs at the 6-minute mark, and debaters are still yet to take one. We will impose the mandatory POI rule. So just to remind everyone, calling leader of opposition.
Hello, just checking if I'm audible.
You're audible.
All right, cool. Okay, hold on. Okay, so POI through chat exclusively. I easily get distracted, so please put it in the chat box. No preferred gender pronouns as well. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In many contexts of the world, education is deprioritized by many governments. The deprioritization of education in many countries is a pressing global issue that has resulted in significant challenges within the public education systems. Over the past few decades, education has often been pushed to the periphery of national agendas. Talk about the constant decrease in government budget, with DepEd by around 6% in 2024, which is a lot. This neglect has led to a chronic underfunding of public schools, resulting in overcrowded classrooms, insufficient educational materials, and a lack of adequate infrastructure. And in the many developing countries, classrooms are filled beyond capacity, with teacher-to-student ratios far exceeding the recommended levels. We think that schools face crumbling buildings, for example, lack of basic amenities like clean water and sanitation, and outdated or insufficient learning resources. We think that it is reckless and morally irresponsible for the government to compel the 1% elite to send their children to public school. This is the definitional challenge. Panel, the 1% does not refer to the randomized people. These are the elite. The 1% includes individuals and households that earn more income than the vast majority of population. This group often has substantial financial resources, including high salaries, significant investments, and other forms of wealth, like Villiers, like Seas, for example. Clarification, we think that there are two specific standards of when state can compel something to happen. Firstly, we think that they can do it on the instance that results to moral good. But secondly, they have to be able to do this as a resolution to the state's moral failings, for example. We will prove to you then that in these two particular stances, it's not principally responsible for the state to compel the 1% or the children of the 1% to be sent to the public school. We tell you that this action is not in any way a fulfillment of either. A quick response to one of the major discussion from PM before proceeding with my arguments. They said, look, state is going to be incentivized to prioritize public education system just because you randomize people and get 1% to attend public school system. Firstly, this is so unclear. Like, how exactly is this going to mechanize in the first place? But secondly, we say that resource allocation is a complex issue. And we do not just assign like budgets to certain sectors. It has to come with a lot of deliberations, for example. So it's unclear why this particular argument can fly in debate. Two particular arguments for you, which ultimately is also going to respond to the framing of randomization by Gov. Firstly, I'll talk about why on principle, autonomy and parental choice is an important principle. But secondly, I'll also discuss why, given the lack of resources in the public education system, you're going to continuously going to make it worse because of this particular policy. Firstly, in terms of principle, and this is also going to respond to the argument of Gov about why it's okay to infringe on this particular principle. First, we think that compelling the wealthiest 1% to send their children to public school infringes upon fundamental parental rights to choose the best educational environment for their children. We think that parents have the right to select schools that align with their priorities and expectations for their children's education. Such a mandate disregards the autonomy of families to make decisions that they believe are in the best interest of their children, particularly when it comes to their education, socialization, and extracurricular opportunities. Infringing these rights are bad because parental autonomy, or autonomy in general, and choice is a core principle in many democratic societies. It encompasses the right of parents to make decisions about their children's upbringing, including their education. We think that this is a right, while not absolute, as we concede to PM, is a fundamental one that government has to be able to prioritize and protect. Gov has to prove that there is a major reason to infringe on this right, given that PM said these rights are not absolute. So, state parental, they have to prove why state has to intervene to make this decision. Because for the longest time, the state are only able or are only allowed to intervene on cases concerning one, public safety, or two, when the parents cannot make these decisions for their children in the first place. Second discussion, pragmatics in terms of the lack of resources in public education system. We think that because of this mandate, you're going to take away all resources from those who actually need this. In public schools in many countries, they're already struggling with limited resources, overcrowding, and lack of infrastructure. Forcing an influx of students from affluent families could exacerbate these problems rather than solve them. The policy could lead to further strain on public school system. The mechanism is all schools, especially public schools, have limited slots to accommodate the increasing number of children that deserves and have the right to education in the first place. The moment that you compel these children of the 1%, they're fundamentally going to take the slots of those who should have been able to attend these public schools, those who cannot afford to enroll themselves in international schools, in private schools, what have you. This is bad because you further jeopardize the kids and go against the core principle of public education, which is to provide accessibility and to allow kids to be able to access education. But secondly, we think that it also negatively affects the kids, even those from the 1%. Enforcing such policy leads to extreme social tensions within public school systems. Students from vastly different socioeconomic backgrounds will face difficulties integrating given the major differences in things like personal experience, struggles, etc., that ultimately leads to social segregation within schools, like bullying, for example, or other forms of discrimination. This is likely because these differences can create friction as students may struggle to relate to one another and face these specific challenges and understanding. But thirdly, in terms of the idea that all right, we're sending 1% for them to be able to learn about the struggles and the plight of the poor, we tell you that this is not going to happen. They will not learn anyway. First level of analysis, we think that merely placing affluent students in public school does not necessarily guarantee a deep or authentic understanding of poverty. Their experience may remain superficial, limited to brief interactions or observations rather than immersive, empathetic understanding of the daily realities faced by lower income families. For example, given that their lives are still ultimately privileged, this is likely because their pattern of life still revolves around their privilege, being sent to school using a car, for example, or having to be able to afford anything that they want. This policy might lead to tokenistic efforts where affluent students participate in activities or programs designed to quote unquote bridge the gap. But without a true engagement with these specific challenges, we think that it results to superficial understanding rather than a profound awareness and empathy. For all those two reasons, proud to oppose, sorry.
Thank you so much for that speech, calling on Deputy Prime Minister.
Hey everyone, can I be heard?
Yep, you can be heard.
Okay, so POIs, I take back my chat earlier because I'm reading through my phone lang. So POIs through chat because I opened a separate device for it for the Zoom thing. So my name is Chris, pronouns she, her, POI on chat. I'll take one and I'm gonna wait. Give me a few minutes. I'm just gonna organize things. So, okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, notice on how opposition came into this bench also acknowledging the problems that we already acknowledged. We acknowledge the fact that there is a lack of resources, there is a lack of proper distribution in the resources that we have towards our education system that has been already discussed by our Prime Minister. These inherent problems are problems that we recognize, we seek to solve, that we already recognize on our side. And notice on how resource allocation as a counter proposal or another mechanism from set by leader of opposition was also already discussed even as early as the first part of my Prime Minister's speech. Prime Minister already told you that that this debate's goal is to improve state of education through collaborative efforts of state, schools, and parents. The principles that we shared to you, which are properly unaddressed by opposition, were the principles of social contract and parents patriae. We believe that these principles ultimately are the principles that should only be considered in this debate, because at the very basis of this debate is how the state is morally responsible on what is its moral infringement, what its moral failings towards the people. These were also the two standards that leader of opposition is clearly tipping towards us, that parents can only state can only act when it is for moral good, and it is a resolution to moral failings. And that is why this debate happens in the first place, because there is a moral failing in terms of our basic education sector, and it is for the moral good of everyone to benefit that these randomized, not just the elite, because we believe that it will provide an equal playing it will provide an equal or fair part for the not just the students but also those educational providers to be able to provide, to cater towards these different needs, because we believe that ultimately these types of policies compels the state to be able to provide what is the best towards its students, which was completely lacking from the discussion of opposition. Before I move on, yes, what's your point?
Hi. So how does your policy solve the issue? If your 1% is made up of students who come from diverse backgrounds, like what's your metric for determining the 1% in order to solve the issue that you have been, discussing?
Okay, so answer that, it was already mentioned by my prime minister that this isn't just like this isn't just like selecting people from like different backgrounds. This is through birth lotteries, which are already present like in other forms of systems, and we believe that ultimately this provides an equal or an equal an equal playing part for those that will part for those that are under this government. And notice the unresponsiveness and the lack of engagement from the two from the two from the two principles that we discuss you from leader of opposition himself. So even if we bite that the 1% consists of the elites and whatnots, the top of the bracket, we ultimately believe that even if it is the elites, the education sector is still more incentivized to provide even better quality of education system, because they believe that these 1% are like major contributors to the economy, and like this 1%, when their needs are not when their needs will are not heard or whatnot, or there's a lack or there's moral failings to fulfill their needs, we believe that this 1% will lobby harder, because it is the like bringing up to you the principle that we have the parents patriae, that the state is the major parent of its society, and we believe that that is that ultimately is the most important factor that we should consider in this debate, saying that this is a policy motion. To answer the arguments from the opposition, is that it takes away opposition said that it takes away resources that should be from for poor people, and we believe that ultimately that is not the case, because when the government when the government compels their parents to send a population of something to a public school, we ultimately believe that it is more likely that the government will put up more facilities, will put up more facilities, will put up more funds, and will put up more resources, so that these types of facilities will now then be like answered, or will now then be like these types of facility will be able to cater towards the 1% that is chosen to attend basic education curriculum in public schools. And ultimately, we believe that opposition clearly loses this debate on the mere metric that they are unresponsive towards what is being proposed from the government, because what we have said to you, that there are two roles of the state, parents patriae, and the parent and the state being socially contracted towards its citizens, and that itself answers the moral good argument of opposition. We are socially contracted towards our state, and the state is socially contracted towards us to provide us resources that will benefit us us and the common good. And towards my extensions, principles are already present from my prime minister and my second from my prime minister, and we ultimately believe that even here at deputy we already win this case, because when we require randomized selection of members to send their children to public schools, the government exercises the authority delegated to it by the people to ensure that public education remains strong and equitable. The citizens have entrusted the government with this power to make the decisions that will improve quality of education and like societal welfare in general. We actually like capitalize on what we voted like this government for. Uh, since it is like responsible for creating fair and high quality education system, we believe that ultimately quality education system is best answered on our side of the house, because we already illustrated you how it will go, and we have already like we already believe that these policies, when entrusted to the state, would like create a more like it creates a more sense of responsibility towards the state because they are more likely to be made accountable. And with all those reasons, we're very, very, very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that speech, calling in Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Yung computer audio ulit ba?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, I'm JC. Few eyes, my voice. No preferred gender pronouns. Just setting up my timer. Gonna start. Ay! Sorry. Kala ko nawala. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. For the state to help and improve education, they can focus on resource allocation and improve facilities. Both are not inherent nor contingent on compelling the 1% students to go to public schools. If Gov wants the state to improve facilities, they can do this without the compulsion alone. This is why they lose from the onset because they peg their arguments without any analytical connection. But more importantly, I would suggest that government makes two fundamental errors in the round. Their first flaw is their lack of meaningful engagement against our first speaker. In Dixter's speech, we argued that the compulsion is infringing on the right of autonomy and choice, and that the compulsion disproportionately allocates the limited resources of the state for the poor to the rich. The only response that we hear from them is that they agree that these problems are same, and that these are the very issues that they consider in proposing the compulsion, and that this particularly solves them. Note that this is insufficient to take down our case because it does not disprove why compulsion automatically leads to increased funding or like schools having support and resources. Like why even is the principle of choice, should it be infringed on their side, solely be accepted based on the arbitrary goal of the government alleging they ultimately improve education. I would note that this failure to meaningfully respond to our case suggests that our case ultimately remains undisputed. Their second flaw then is their crux in their arguments. The only meaningful thing that they actually argue is that they will improve the state and quality of education. Three things. One, this is untrue because quality of education is not based on compelling the rich or a randomized set of people to have access on like public education. Sure, they can probably increase educational access, but essentially this is based on factor like the quality in itself is based on factors like instructional pedagogy, like schools resources and funding, which are not promised through the compulsion. But there are other alternatives that exist that are ultimately way better for improving the educational quality, such as allocating more funding to schools, improving improving instructor competence to trainings, etc. But even if this is true, this exists on a niche context and situations, and this is like ultimately affected by people who are. Wait, can you pause my laptop lag?
It's paused.
Sorry. Wait, my laptop lag. Can I borrow your? Sorry. Okay, it's working now. I'm so sorry. Okay. I'm gonna restart my speech from the sorry, what part did you hear last?
Well, you were kind of arguing about how the compulsion does not
Okay.
necessarily resolve majority of the problems.
Okay. Restarting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I would argue that there are better alternatives that exist to better and ensure the improvement of the educational quality, such as allocating more funding to schools, improving institutional and instructor competence through skills trainings, and etc. But even if this is true, they exist on niche contexts and situations that's ultimately affected by other variables, meaning even if like the compulsion improves the quality of education, it is not the tipping point that influences that change. The last thing that they say is that they get collaborative learning experience. Note that Gov is debating on two frames. PM says that it's random, so probably it's going to be both the rich and the poor, but DPM says that it's going to be out of birth lottery, so probably it's just going to be the poor. I would suggest that these two frames clashes on their promise of collaborative learning because literally it's unclear who is collaborating. But apart from these errors, I suggest our case independently wins us the round because the most important cash in the round is securing the education of the most vulnerable, like the poor. This is true because the state in both sides have limited resources. Even if this motion happens in a functional liberal democracy, funding in general for education is limited because we also need to fund for other state expenses like social services. In this regard, we argue that the poor students is the most vulnerable and the most important because their existence is a consequence to states' moral failings and their policies, meaning the state should focus on how we can better serve these people, which is exclusive in our side, should we not take away the opportunities for poor students to achieve their education. The next thing that I'll do is just extend on two things. First, explain why this compulsion does not solve the issue of rich social detachment, and explain why this is a net harm to underprivileged students in the public institutions. First, I argue that this compulsion does not solve the issue of privilege detachment from social reality because we argue that the rich is presently detached from them and like basically being apolitical or like being socially neutral. Note that this extension also tackles the collaborative learning that comes from DPM. I would argue that this compulsion does not solve the issue and it worsens it simply because going to public school does not capture the actual social suffering that is happening on the ground. Insofar as educational structures have the incentive to shield children from moral failures and bad policies or even injustices that exist in the world. This looks like censoring violence and injustices from students because they can be traumatic and inappropriate for students altogether. In fact, I argue that you worsen privilege, neutrality, and apoliticality because of two reasons. A, you give the rich bargaining chips to argue against the struggles of the masses because you allow them to feel entitled to their co-experiences such that the rich is going to feel that the actual school-related issues are not as severe because they share the same curriculum, classroom, and listen to the same lectures being taught in public schools. This is bad because usually the rich, given their privilege, are able to circumvent the structural oppression and suffering subconsciously. For instance, they can easily research and do their assignments. They can actively participate in classes because they don't need to problematize on their lunch, as opposed to the poor students who need to go without having food, or because they don't need to commute going to and away from the school. But they can also do well in class just because they can get access resources like tutors and etc. UI.
Can state not reallocate its resources as early as now? And even if it has done so in the past, why did it not work? And if not, why have they not done it?
Your whip needs to prove why state allocating resources is inherent or contingent on the compulsion. We prove that they can exist without the compulsion. B, you give the rich an added entitlement that allows them to oversimplify the narrative and struggles of the poorer students. Poorer students' issues and are usually based on invisible, covert, and clandestine factors like power, culture, and wealth, which people often cannot consciously account as a privilege on their part because of cognitive dissonance or the direct denial that exists from these particular students in general. Both of these prove that compelling the rich students to study in public schools do not solve the issue of social detachment and ultimately social neutrality. Sorry, pause again. May laptop plug again. Okay, sorry. Bad day. Okay, sorry. Can I start now?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Gonna start in 3, 2, 1. Note that this is important in the round because it proves that there are societal and discursive ramifications to this compulsion that only empowers privilege entitlement and even fuels the issues because the rich can now feel that they have a safety net to go against and feel entitled against the poor because they share the same spaces and same experiences. Second, and very briefly, I argue that the compulsion is going to be bad for underprivileged kids in the schools. Three actual reasons to prove this. One, rich kids studying in public schools intensify the hierarchy and imbalance in the classroom because they can naturally do better than the poorer counterparts. This means that poorer kids are going to feel pressured and expected to do even better, even more. And this is bad because this is ultimately based on the teacher. On essentially, if a teacher gets a requirement that's better from that rich student, that's also going to affect how they grade other requirements from other students. Like essentially, if a better student submits a better requirement because they're rich, that's also going to be paramount to how you're going to grade poorer students altogether. But two, rich kids are likely going to control the ranking system, so they are more likely going to be the people who's going to graduate as valedictorian and salutatorian, which is the net harm because the distinctions are usually the only chances for the underprivileged students to get into college. On this regard, you infringe on the chances of students to ensure their education in the future, potentially concentrating scholarship to the rich, worsening unfairness and the educational system overall. Clearly, we win.
Thank you so much for that speech. Calling on Government Whip.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yep, you are audible.
Thank you. I will just set up my timer. So yeah. So I'll be starting my speech in three, two, one. Panel, notice on how the opposition came into this debate. They came into this debate demonizing the educational system that we already have in the status quo, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we believe that this is wrong because first and foremost, this educational system that we are already having still produces a lot of competent people in both in local and international levels, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I believe that by having this 1%, we believe that by having this 1% being compelled into schools would not only promote the educational system here in our country, but also it would improve um, in the future. So, going into my rebuttals, first is that they have stated that schools are under budget. Now, it's true. However, that is why we need to have this so that now the state would be incentivized and would do better, ladies and gentlemen, in which it has already been discussed by the two previous by my two previous speakers, in which the state would now be incentivized given the fact that they are compelling the 1% of the population to school, ladies and gentlemen. Hence, the government would do better. Now, second is that I would now be going into my biggest skill, in which they have their basically their main argument only focused on the autonomy of the parents, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this is false since autonomy is not absolute. We can't, as per stated by my previous speakers, is that we can't choose anything and everything that we want, ladies and gentlemen, meaning there are limitations to what we or the parents can do or can decide for their children. Especially that not all parents can send their children to international schools even if they want to because of lack of finance. Hence, by this randomization uh, of compelling students into schools, it would help these people would in attaining education. Now, even if of course parents do have the absolute autonomy of choosing what's best for the child, still it is in the best interest of the state to provide what's better for the society, because of course it has been mentioned many times by my previous speakers about the parents patriae, in which they fail to engage on that part, in which the state have the utmost responsibility to cater to the needs of this society. They have failed to answer on that part, and that again, now I will be moving on into my slide rebuilding. Now, the other benchmen argued that autonomy are absolute and have urged us to answer to this. Now, we will bite that bullet and we will discuss on why autonomy is not absolute, especially on education. Now, as per discussed by my earlier by my PM, it is the state's responsibility for the betterment of the society. The state is more incentivized to answer the problems present in the educational system because they have an image to fulfill, knowing the fact that they compel citizens to give more pressure for the state. I mean, it would give more pressure to the states that the citizens waive their choice that would make the state accountable, ladies and gentlemen. Because at the end of the day, they failed to take into account that we have already answered this. Because first is that the by having this 1% randomization compelled into schools, first it would solve the problem for the lack of education. Why is this so? Because now the state is compelling us to go into schools. In fact, if people don't or are not compelled to go to schools, then obviously there are parents that would just let their children be and would not even take into account of sending them to schools. Second is that the government will be more incentivized. Now, the goal that they are trying to have or to achieve is best on our side, because basically what we are trying to solve here is the lack of education. Meaning, we are now sourcing or we are now compelling these people to go to schools, to public schools, to have their education, in which, of course, it would ultimately, if this 1% continues in a trend, ultimately by how many years it would now solve the crisis of on education panel. Now, we have two issues in this debate. Is that first is that where would this 1% be better off, and then second is that where does society better off. First issue is that this issue is important because this 1% would be still taken care of, wherein they would not be disregarded by the state, in which they will be compelled to do or to go to school in order for them to have better jobs or better life in the future. Now, second is that when of course when society where does society better off, we believe that society is better off on our side because of course, as I have stated, when this trend of continually or annually compelling this 1% to go to school, eventually there will come a time wherein all of the citizens would be now educated at the end of the day, panel. Because if you continue a bit, because if you continue on towards these statistics, this 1% would be piling up at the end of the
Point.
day. Now, it's already 7 minutes. So the best case of the opponent here is that the opposition here, the best case of the opposition here is that the citizens would still be able to exercise their freedom of choice or autonomy. However, this will not stand, since even if these people would still be, even if this people would still be able to exercise their autonomy, there is still it won't solve the problem of education on their part, since of course what if these people exercise their right and not go to school, right? So what is our worst case is that our worst case here is that um, it is randomized, but still at the end of the day we will still win, because if you will look at the statistics, this 1% would automatically pile up and then would eventually solve the educational crisis. And with that, I would like to end my speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now calling on opposition whip.
Hi, confirming that I'm visible and audible.
Visible and audible, yes.
All right, gotcha. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2,
Hold on. You're now
1. Starting
correct.
with callouts and issues. Until government whip, we are unsure about government's. Yeah, hello. Hello.
Sorry.
Hello, can you hear
became
me?
robotic now. Yeah, I can
Is it
hear you
okay?
now. Yep, you're okay now.
Okay. How about I'm okay now?
Yep. But I think it's better if you
I'll
turn off the
just
camera.
turn off my camera.
Yep.
How about
Can you
now?
try again?
This house believes that the 1% should be compelled to send their children to public schools.
Yep, it's better. Thank you so much.
All right, it's better. Okay. Gotcha. All right. Yell, POIs through voice, through badger, no preferred gender pronouns. Restarting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll start with callouts, then issues. Until government whip, we are unsure about government's policy. They say the 1% is made up of students from families from diverse backgrounds. So like this is the 1% of like something. This is why Drickster's definitional challenge still stands, because what is the metric of the 1% in the motion when like it is random coming from government? They tried saying, it's birth lottery, come their deputy. So you are born in a particular village. How does that mean you are 1%? 1% of the population? I'm unsure, but we'll engage, right? Before issues again, I would just like to call out WHIP saying that the school system is okay. We just need to improve it, despite the fact that their constructive says there is an urgent need to address the ills of the public school systems. Like, which is it? If it is nuanced, as WHIP presumably says, and I'm building for them, then they have more of a burden to justify why compelling is necessary, right? So two issues. The first is it justified for the state to step in and compel the inaction of the policy? In order to win this issue, government has to really characterize what is the metric for the state to step in. The government said, it's because of scarce resources. So I have three responses. Number one, this is true. This is a concession in the debate, but how would compelling the 1% of random people or of, people born in, I don't know, District 12 would solve this? Number two, but even if it is true, the policy goes against the principle of choice, which, while not absolute, which we acknowledge, government has to give reasons as to why the state has to override this choice, and overriding this choice has ramifications, which my constructive already discussed, right? The scarcity of the resources has to be weighed in against stepping in this principle of choice and accessibility, right? Number three, I posit as a matter of extent, we are actually better than government in saving the little resources that we have in status quo, because A, we do not have to cater to both the disadvantage, which the state has to cater to using the public education system, and the 1%, whatever the 1% is, be it socioeconomic status or performance, or they came from District 12, right? B, this would mean less work in our world, less work for the school administrators and that officials, for example, who have to enforce the rule. If we are talking about the 1% as the affluent, or in government's counterfactual, they still have to make it so that the 1% of the most well-performing student, or whatever metric they decide, has to get in, right? The state in their counterfactual has to ensure accountability, which would mean they would have to probably in their world, right? Assume they have fiat, right? But they still have to ensure that the 1% really does have to get in. So they would have to build more of check and balance mechanisms in order to ensure the accountability that they have been clamoring for across all speakers. So basically, less work, less resources in our world. On our side, we actually address that problem of scarce resources. We do not have to allocate it to, like, say, for example, check and balance mechanisms, additional additional check and balance mechanisms, what have you, right? In comparison, we told you that a state can only step in insofar as the policy is, number one, is a moral good. Number two, resolution to a moral failing. Note that, again, we did not say that the principle of choice and autonomy is not absolute. Is absolute. It's not absolute. You just need a reason why the state has to step in to override these rights. My prime minister told you why it's not a moral good. Because number one, this infringes on the choice of the 1%. And this is where I will discuss, the 1% in all of the frames that transpired in the debate. Because government introduced a lot of definitions as to what that 1% really is. So if they're rich, right? We are not defending them. It's just that there are ramifications if you choose to infringe on the choice of 1% as the rich, for example. So in our frame, right? So if the 1% are made up of the Ayalas or the people who own homes in some fancy subdivision in Magallanes, right? So admittedly, in our definition of the 1% holds political power. Compelling them to something would mean they are less likely to cooperate with the state when it comes to its policy. Say, for example, giving up land or selling land for citizen reallocation purposes. This response is effective insofar as government failed to give reasons why the 1%, regardless of what that is, or if it's the rich, would be on board the state forcing their scions or their children to go to a particular school when they could go to, I don't know, ADMO or DLSU or some international school like we've seen in your favorite Netflix series. B, less likely that the children of the 1% are probably going to excel, right? Because they're being compelled to a school. And what if they don't want that particular school? Or the fact that they're being compelled to that means that you're actually dictating their choice already, which would mean probably what if they want to go to ADMO or DLSU, right? They're probably less going to excel, which my constructives already discussed, which would mean it's a waste of resources. Now, if the 1% is random or probably based on performance or worse, birth, then the principle of choice is all the more important because you are depriving those who might perform well in a particular school of the choice to choose their paths. Look, ADMO, DLSU, even UP has scholarships. Sometimes well-performing kids want to go to elite schools because either of the degree program or maybe the school environment or philosophy or in terms of their geographical location, if the 1% is random or it's because of birth, the principle of choice then should have to be protected all the more, because you're basically born, because like you're forcing them. Like, what if you're born at District 12 and you want to go to a mining school? What if you're being forced to go to the capital and go to a fashion school? I don't know, right? Number two, compelling them goes against the very principle of the public school education system in the first place. The 1% in status quo, absent the counterfaction from government, has a choice to go to ADMO and the LSU. Well, status quo has problems, we acknowledge it. At least there is less of a compelling factor in our world. In government counterfactual, the 1% has to compete with a disadvantage, and of course, they're less likely to excel, right? The scarcity of resources being a moral failing of the state, then the solution is not to compel them, as what JC told you. Government can focus on other policies, on weighing. We have more MEC. Number two, we justified why the principle of the education system has to still stand, that it has to cater to the disadvantage. The choice still ultimately matters, absent the justifications from Gov. Number three, we do not already burden an already burdened system. The second issue then, really quickly, does the policy bring a net good or does it bring a net harm? They say government just asserted impacts, like, you know, you have less people to cater to in their counterfactual. Number one, how exactly? Number two, even if that is the case, and even if you have fiat, you still have to discuss with whoever are the 1%, be it socioeconomic status or birth lottery, that they have to be on board with this. If they are not, they would be less likely to cooperate with you with the policy. Number three, what then is the difference of their policy to status quo and other alternatives, which JC told you, absent this comparative from government, their justification just does not exist. Because what did we tell you? We told you that students who are disadvantaged financially, right? Disadvantaged students have to compete with the affluent in their counterfactual because the affluent is compelled. The net harm are, if they are on the same class with disadvantaged students, the affluent has the capacity to perform better, which would mean standard inside the classroom skews towards them. B, parents are held accountable. They told you this as a policy of accountability, assuming they are, and assuming we are working in their frame. So this would mean if a student is not performing, the parents would be held accountable in court. So like you are further disadvantaging the disadvantaged, right? On school system, we told you that you can already focus on other schools. They told you that, hey, this is compelling people to go to school. Like, this problem does not happen in status quo, even if it does. Like, you know, some people would rather hustle than go to the traditional meritocratic way of being successful in life. Considering all these, we clearly win oppose. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. Calling on opposition reply.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. Thumbs up that my laptop was not long. But okay. Wait, give me a sec. Just setting up my timer. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Reading is important, especially the qualifiers in between words. This debate is about the 1% being mandated to send their kids to public schools. I suggest that this is the basic premise of the motion and therefore is ultimately disregarded from government, which means they lose. 1, they squirrel this debate because they argue that the 1% is going to be placed at random. This is factually incorrect because it's basic and common knowledge to note that the 1% is in fact the rich. But note that you can't fault us in their misframing of the motion. In fact, Dexter calls them out and clarifies what this debate is about, warranting a fair merit from the judges because as early as LO, we fulfill the actual heart of this motion. But B, note as well that if we even engage on their faulty frame, in Dictor's and my speech, we argue that having random mandated students still infringes on the right of the poor students, since the rich can still get access to be forced to go to public schools. But 2, they misconstrue being compelled to go to public schools to going to schools altogether. In Gov's speech, I argue that the clearest case from their side just became clear on their speech, and they want to compel students to go to school alone. However, the issue here is that they never prove why it should be public schools altogether. Literally, why not private schools, or have conditional caveats like the rich to private schools and the poor to public schools if they in fact want it to be at random. This is not me jumping in the round, but clarifying their implied case and their glaring failures as government. Therefore, you can only give them presumably the win if you believe their case on improving the educational system and its quality. I'll take the high horse and prove why even if they win this clash, this win is extremely narrow, and more importantly, why it's not the most significant issue in the debate. First, why their win of the clash is narrow and slim. One, in Victor's speech, we clarified that their proposal to compel the 1% to send their kids to school is not paramount or related to improving schools, since they can exist independent of each other. In my speech, I extend this case by arguing against the connection of improved school facilities and curriculum based on this mandate. If you believe or even if you vibe check this, like, you can feel that improving schools can exist in either sides of the house, even better in our side, because now you can focus as a state on actually allocating resources instead of tackling and addressing the moral issues of compelling against autonomy and choice, or its social ramifications like worsening the student tensions between the rich and the poor, or worsening the social entitlement of the rich. But two, in my speech as well, we argue that improving the quality of education in their side is unclear because they don't provide their only mech of collaborative learning is the tipping point to solve educational failings. In fact, we argue that the collaborative learning is bad in three ways. Because A, it creates interpersonal tensions between the rich and the poor. B, you worsen the imbalance and unfairness in the educational system, which was also rebuilded by OPWEP, that the privileged and the rich also gets to be like the skewed standard of what's good and what's excellent, ultimately like making it easier for them to excel and making it structurally disadvantageous and disproportional to the poor. But C, that it worsens the social detachment and entitlement of the rich because you give them a bargaining chip to oversimplify the sufferings of the poor, because they can easily now say that they share the same experience and spaces without any clear acknowledgement of their upliftment based on covert factors like their power, culture, and wealth, something that was clear from my speech as well. Both of these prove that even if they win this issue, it's marginal, but then again, I would suggest that they don't actually win this issue. Second then, why is this not the most important issue in the round? I argue in my speech that the most important clash is securing the education of the most vulnerable, specifically the poor. This is true because the state in both sides have limited resources. So even if you have like even if you're in a functional liberal democracy, funding is still limited because you also need to fund for like other social services. In this regard, we argue that the poor students is the most vulnerable and is the most important because their existence, them being disadvantaged and poor, is a consequence to the state's moral and political failings, meaning the state should focus on how we can better serve these people, which is exclusive in opposition should we do not take away the opportunities for the poor students to achieve their education inside Gov. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on government reply.
Hi everyone, can I be heard?
Yep.
Okay, wait. I'm just gonna like organize this. Okay, so I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Notice panel on how the only constructive coming from opposition is about how resource allocation is the best answer towards this, because it would have better check and balances mechanism on their side, because it takes more it reallocates the funds from like the education sector. First of all, I'd like to point out two things. There's gross misinterpretation from opposition on what our side is, and obviously there's selective hearing on what our case is all about. We actually acknowledge the fact that they had definite we acknowledge the fact that these are inherent problems that are present in society, but we ultimately believe that these problems are better solved on our side of the house, because these problems are problems that are existing in the status quo, and opposition has to defend why status quo at its best is good, or is good as is. So ultimately, we believe that if government right now, government meaning the state right now has the power to like reallocate all these sources and like all these funds, but why have they not been doing it? And even if they had been doing it, why has it not worked? Because that is the question, that is the problem, that is the inherent problem on like the steps that the state could have taken, but they did not take. Hence why there is a proposal coming from the government that we should take a hardline another solution, because it seems the fact that you are completely missing the bullet, that these types of solution can be done and would have been done if the state had like had the initiatives and like the incentive factors of doing it, and ultimately we believe that this is a winning case from government at this point, because we believe that when there is that what has been discussed by opposition whip, that these check and balances mechanism are far better off on our side of the house, because if they take that as their winning case, the check and balances mechanism, it is far better on our side of the house, because we actually can take like accountable, because we are stripping off, we are socially contracted towards like these types of people, because we waive them like a principle that they should have. So in return, the government is socially contracted to fulfill their part of the role, which is clearly lacking from, which clearly lacked engagement from all of opposition. Okay, let's take the bite that they like there is like discussion on how choice and whatnot is, but ultimately these choices can be waived if the government has if society, or like if the state has like safety nets on how this would run out. And it's very evident on opposition side, that they misinterpreted this case, because even if we considered to the fact that all of these definitional challenges coming from opposition, we agree to the fact that like quality education is better on achieved on our house, because like we are not robbing poor people out of their stress, because there it is still ranking based and whatnot. Like there are still rubrics, and like even schools like UP, like they look into your background and all of those things. And like if, at the very least, these public schools, like from the basic education curriculum, which have been reinstated multiple times, we ultimately believe that these types, the benefits mentioned from opposition are benefits that are not mutually exclusive to their side only, because these benefits are better off on our house, and these benefits are better off implied on our house, because checks and balance mechanisms are more are taken in our house at a more like stringent level, because these like the government is like principally delegating its like authority towards the parents, and in return the government needs to fulfill a role. And if like and like we have already illustrated you things about like social contract theory, and we believe that the unresponsiveness from and lack of engagement from opposition on that case makes us already win this debate. And with all of those things, we're so proud to propose. Excuse me, can I like and I leave from the call? I need to do something really important. Okay, thank
Yep,
you,
sure.
thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for the debate. You may now cross the house. I'll give us time to submit the ballots and prepare the oral adjudication. Vincent, can we like go to feedback one voice channel, if it's fine with you?
All right, we'll
Alright.
be in there.
Opposition.
Hi, opposition is here.
Alright, so yep, I'm just here to announce a decision. Vincent gets to deliver their oral adjudication first. So in a unanimous decision, we are giving the win to side opposition. Again, side opposition Malcolm Hall wins the debate. So yep, Vincent, whenever you are ready.
All right. Thank you guys. Congratulations to opposition. So this is how my oral adjudication will go. Wait, let me just start my timer. All right. This is how my oral adjudication will go. I'll give the decision again, and I'll proceed to general comments. And then I'll give you guys the main issues that I've then identified in the debate, and then my justifications will be given along the way. So, firstly, on decision, I give the win again to opposition sides. Congratulations to opposition and commiserations to government. Firstly, on general comments, I think that both sides should generally spend a lot of time explicitly defining unclear parts of the motion, even though they seem self-explanatory. I think a lot of the issues and the uncleared ambiguity led to the confusion throughout the early half of the debate. Much could have been talked early on, absent the clash on what initially seemed like self-explanatory framing. Given this, I think it's also important for both teams to maintain consistency. The definitional challenges, these are very much accepted in debate, and it would help for teams to engage their opposing teams' counterframe or buy it and operate flip-flops already, then the saving grace is to keep going and not necessarily continue fighting on a hill you're willing to die on. I think that consistency is just very much important and highly appreciated the side of an average reasonable person. The second general comment I have very quickly is that a huge chunk of the debate operated on the macro scale, despite it not being an actor motion. I still think it could have helped to be more nuanced on the tendencies, interests, and capacities of the 1%, which would have greatly strengthened both sides' case if these were treated more as active players in the debate rather than just passive receivers of the policy. There are repercussions to affecting the lives of people, especially the ultra elite, and these impacts are of themselves another clash. All right, right. So it's tempting to also very like railroad as much claims as you can. This applies for both opposition and government, but it's also helpful to visualize impacts in a way that's tangible or helpful to magnify your case to the average reasonable person. It's also helpful for opposition to present a concrete alternative, even though, this is not necessary. It would help boost up your chances to win the debate if you can provide alternatives that the average reasonable person can believe in. Overall, I commend both sides. There should have been more engagement, to be frank, and that would have generally elevated the debate. But rest assured, these general comments do not factor into the decision that I made. Going on to the issues, I've identified two. The first one is on the solvency on the macro scale. Where does this policy create the most net gain for society and for the education system? And secondly, briefly on the micro scale on principles and whether this policy is justified. On to the first issue, I think that both sides identified crucial problems in status quo, that there are state failures and there's currently there's the poor education system that we all suffer from. Both sides engage in pragmatic clashes that have defined the goals of the debate, which is to essentially improve the education system for the most vulnerable in the long term, right? Both sides agree that there is a current failure from the state. There ought to be something done about it. The main clash has therefore been on the solvency of this policy, on whether the allocation of resources and whether the compulsion leads to solving the problems that both sides generally agree are important. What did government say? Right from the get-go, there is a fundamental flaw, unfortunately, in setup. That government, framed that 1% referred to 1% of the population. However, I know it is conventionally understood that the 1% refers to the top 1%. Opposition had to clearly and explicitly challenge this, and they did. This was mostly to the detriment of government side. But let's still take what they said. The state, coming from government side, said that they will be compelled to improve the education system. They say that it's part of collaboration that the parents will collaborate to improve the education system, that schools and states will be pressured to do this. I think that right from the get-go, this is still unclear how this is part of government's burden exclusively. I think this was rightly called out in opposition. What is the unique delta of having the 1% elite students? How does that lead to pressure to the state? Lots of analytical gaps have to be said explicitly and expounded on government side. You also explained on pressure that, the elite are important to the country and that the elite cause like this incentive structure to manifest. That you also say something on the state being the parent of the country, that there will be a sense of responsibility. Again, a lot of these claims are not really built. It is unclear also why this matters, how this ties back to the mechanism for the argument that the education system will improve. It has to be believable and would it would help to break down the effect that you're trying to go for. A lot of another extraneous analysis coming from WIP is that, at the end of the day, the citizens will be educated because 1% will pile up year on year. A lot of these are scattered around. There should have been more analytical connections. There should have been more clear mechanisms coming from government for me to be able to buy their claims. Coming from opposition, what did they say? Their main push was that this disproportionately allocates resources from the poor to the rich, that public schools already suffer from low resources. Elite children will just exacerbate this by taking up resources and taking them away from people who deserve them more. And elite children will, this goes against the core principle of public education. You also say something along the lines of the state being, they having to focus on the poor and the most vulnerable. There are other ways to support the upward mobility of the poor. And you also say that the compulsion infringes on the upward mobility of poor students because this constrains their ability to, take opportunities in later life. This concentrates public funds and scholarships to those who don't necessarily deserve it. Opposition rightly responds to a lot of government's scattered claims that the states can improve facilities and the education system either way. And this is not inherent to the policy of compulsion. Government had to prove to me why exclusivity on compulsion is necessary. And on the other hand, opposition also said that on collaboration, it's unclear who will be part of government's policy because government keeps flip-flopping on framing, right? And coming from opposition whip, they say that compelling will just antagonize the 1% and will not lead to cooperation or collaboration that the opposition, the government side wants to see. They cite past instances, and this goes against the fundamental interest of parents. What is the weighing for the first issue? Looking at both sides charitably, the mechanism the government provides to me seems to be there. It's there. The elite people will enter schools, they will demand the state to be better, and therefore the incentive structure manifests for the education system to improve. Even if I disregard all of opposition's counter-analysis to why this isn't possible, and just weigh the benefits and likelihoods of government's model to theirs, it will still be a losing bargain for government. Opposition was simply able to construct more salient impacts in the debate, especially towards the most vulnerable actors, which are the poorer students in society. And absent any substantial engagement from government against these claims, these harms fly eventually, and opposition wins the first clash of the debate. On to the second issue, which was also very important, was the principle of parental autonomy and whether this policy is justified, whether it's a worthy trade-off to disregard, parental autonomy in pursuit of the greater good. Given these pragmatic ramifications from the first issue, the second clash then is on whether these impacts merits or justifies a compulsion and infringement of certain parental rights. Government says that this will create a more inclusive and diverse education system. This was highly unbuilt and there was little to no analysis. I wish this could have been built further, but also primarily government argues that it is in the best interest of the state, and the state ought to do this because one, it's highly likely that the state will take responsibility for children's education. This is something that's justified to do because of state failures in the past, and that parental autonomy can be disregarded or it's not an absolute right. The other thing they say is that there's this principle of parents patriae, which is the state being the parent of all children, the parent of society, and therefore the state has the prerogative to intervene. The government says that parental autonomy is not absolute. However, I think government fails to give sufficient reasons why this is something that I can believe in. Why A, this is worth trading off. There has to be tangible and immediate benefits to justify this. But B, government failed to explain to me why the state cannot just improve conditions and not infringe on these rights as opposition claims without this policy of compelling the elite in the first place. All of this were unclear coming from government, and this was a lot of opportunities for opposition to take this claim essentially for themselves. On opposition, they say that the state has the moral obligation to intervene because the current system is a failure, that citizens ought to be able to choose their public schools for their children as a result of this failure if they want to avoid the problems of the already deteriorating education system. Socially, for parents, they argue on the principle of autonomy and parental choice being highly important. They say that compelling the 1% infringes on personal rights to choose the best schools for the children, and they also say that the parents know best, they know what's best for their children, and infringing these rights are bad because it is against the core principles of democratic societies. Socially, for children, there were also lots of extraneous discussions and nuances on privilege that I think government should have engaged on. They say that this will negatively affect children's perception of privilege. Social segregation will become rampant and arise in schools. These tensions will arise in schools, and this will not lead to the empathy and collaboration as government side would like to posit. Given that their life outside school is still privileged, it's hard not to be affected by the privilege still. It will lead to superficial empathy and tokenism, and at worst, you worsen the privilege neutrality that already exists. The rich can circumvent structural barriers, and being able to give them the space, the common experiences will entitle them to privilege that will just empower them to not this will just create harms for society. I think on opposition, to be fair, I think it's necessary to translate these impacts and engage in opposition's goals as well. How does this entitlement for the privilege hinder systemic changes to the education system? It would have helped to to elaborate on the impacts and the tangible impacts, even if these are just social harms, even if these are just principles. This should have you should have analyzed also, I think, the critical nuance of being in the 1% rather than a generalization that they are privileged to an average reasonable person. I already exist in a world where elite rich people coexist with poorer students in public schools. However, the motion implies a crucial delta that you bring in the elite, and these are not just the rich, these are not just the elite. You're bringing the ultra elite, the sons of billionaires. What is the difference of having rich students in public schools, which probably already exists in the and the nuance of having the ultra elite attend the same schools? I think that provided this deeper nuance characterization, the arguments from opposition could have been more analyzed and impacted. However, notwithstanding all that, I think that opposition still wins the second issue. They were still able to argue that the exclusivity argument, the exclusivity of government's arguments were not there, that they can still solve government's harms without infringing on this particular right, that their principle stands, government side fails. With all that being said, I stand by my decision. Congratulations again, opposition, and I hope to see you guys in future rounds.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. All right, so hi everyone. Welcome back to the round. Again, I'm CJ, now as the chair. This is how my oral adjudication will go. I'll go straight to the justification to my decision, which you all know already. It was a unanimous opposition win. And then later, if I have time, I'll give some general comments. The first thing that I'll do is address the context of the debate and whether we are really talking about a 1% that is randomized or 1% that comprises the rich people or the elites at the end of the day. First, as an average reasonable person, opposition is more correct in pointing out that the 1% consists of the rich people. I said more correct. Later, I'm going to explain why there could have been like a lot of room for opposition to further nuance the debate. This is a common fact that I felt like government was not able to grapple with, that we refer to the privileged people, for example, or billionaires as the 1%, and the rest of the society as the 99%. So in terms of the definition, I would have to side with the opposition more. I think that while there were a lot of overlapping arguments that came from government side to be able to explain the benefits of being able to include them, like in public schools, for example. So talk about the collaboration that we're able to talk about, how states will now become pressured into trying to fix the public educational system. Those things are arguments that I felt like were still overlapping. The problem of you not being able to define the emotion to the most correct way possible is that it hinders you or limited your ability to be able to nuance a lot of important characterizations and contexts that could have been like further solidified if we're able to operate on the correct definition. But that doesn't mean that opposition automatically wins just because they were the one who provided the correct definition. I think there are several other reasons as to why government loses, even if we assume that your definition of the 1% is correct in government. Firstly, it is not clear to me how the randomization will happen exactly. Or will this be a categorically randomized system, for example, i.e. there will be equal number of rich people and middle class people or like lower class people who will be selected to ensure fairness? Or will this be a completely randomized system? I think this is an important observation because your impacts are contingent to this. There was a late clarification from government whip though that implies that the motion assumes that people are not at school, which is why the state should compel the 1% to go to school so they can have education. One, it's a late characterization from whip. I don't think it has been mentioned by PM or DPM. But two, it's already unengaging to the framing of opposition, which again is the more correct frame. And three, even if it's the right framing, government was not able to prove why compelling the 1% is a good tipping point. So you only said that when we compel the 1%, for example, the state will be more accountable, the state will be pressured to fix the educational system. But absent a clear mechanization, it's unclear to me how suddenly the educational system will be better just because a certain population is compelled to study in public schools. So basically, it's not clear to me what is the tipping point for the state to act just because this set of population gets to study in public schools. And the reason why this becomes important is because it has been consistently called out by opposition. They said that the intention of the state to better public schools is not contingent to the compulsion, if indeed there is a responsibility for the state uh, to do this thing as a parent of the society, as government suggests. And as earliest leader of opposition, I think they have already characterized the problems that exist in the public education system that requires the action of the state. So if the metric is just responsibility, opposition was able to provide other reasons for the state to act aside from government's reason of compulsion. Government then had a higher burden to prove why the compulsion is the best tipping point. But even if you do not believe me and that you assume that government was able to prove the tipping point, the second reason as to why opposition still wins is because they were able to prove why status quo is the better choice. And this is where I'm going to flag that I agree with government when they argued that opposition wasn't able to prove their policy. In opposition, it's not clear how the reallocation of resources, for example, or providing skills training will improve public schools in opposition. I think if opposition wants to further widen the margin, you could have proven, for example, what are the driving forces for the state to act and why is it a pushy driving force. But even if I agree on that government call out, the only thing it did was for me to assume that opposition is defending status quo. And the way now becomes, does the model of government make the status quo better or worse? Again, even in the model of government, there is a possibility that the rich people or the real 1% gets to be selected and study in public schools because it's a randomized system. There are a lot of material from opposition that were left unresponded by government, which explains why the placing of privileged individuals further exacerbates the problems in the public education system. If the goal of government is quality and collaborative education system, for example, this is something that can be easily monopolized by the rich, as opposition suggests, for factors such as power asymmetry, resource imbalance, social and class tensions, factors that opposition claim to harm the ability of the underprivileged students to keep up. So even if we credit that late response from government reply that there will be rankings anyway, or that there will be other forms of evaluation to ensure fairness, that still does not answer the problem on fairness posed by opposition. What does this essentially mean for the debate? This means that even if the principle on social contract from government is correct, that the state gives protection and serves their community as long as citizens waive a portion of their rights, for example, it's not clear to me how, one, the state would actually protect and serve their community if opposition explains that the model further pushes the underprivileged people to the losing end, and two, why it has to be the right to select the kind of education as the right that has to be waived. So I get that rights are not absolute. I don't contest like government for that as an average reasonable person, but I felt like it's a lot clearer and more nuanced on the side of opposition why the principle on parental autonomy is important if they also have the responsibility to protect their child from any harms at all, and a harm that is perceived to exist when the government tries to tried to force them and impose a certain model that makes their children study in public schools, for example. How did opposition further widen the margin in the round? So the simplest reason is that they were able to preempt a lot of possible cases for government and responded it on their own. Uh, Even if like it didn't come out of the debate. So for example, Prime Minister argued that it's unlikely for disadvantaged students to learn about the struggles of the poor, for example. So even if they are exposed to such realities, their pattern of life is still centered around their privilege. I think that's a great attempt at the opposition to be engaging, even if government is fixated on their own framing. I also felt like majority of the characterizations that came as early as Prime Minister were ignored by side government. And even if I kind of agree that apparently that is the kind of problem that you want to pose at the end of the day in government, that you also agree that there are a lot of problems in the public education system, things like underfunding, for example, things like lack of classrooms at the end of the day. I felt like the only response that you're able to say that this is exactly why we are proposing the model for us to be able to fix that. But it's not clear to me how the specific problems that came as early as leader of opposition were resolved on the part of government. So how do you even resolve like the underfunding, for example, if you are putting more people reasonably, like how are you going to ensure that there will be more classrooms? So again, it just ties back, even in these types of preemptions, the tieback of these implications is based on the inability of government in this round to be able to prove the tipping point as to why it has to be a necessary compulsion for the state to be able to do in order to ensure that the educational system will be better off at the end of the day. So that's it for my justification. Since I have time, I'll give some quick general comments. The first comment that I have is that both teams are so afraid to talk about the right of the child, because this is not just about the responsibility of the state, right? I don't think the emotion is worded as this house believes that states should compel. So the reason why I'm saying this is that opposition has a lot of space to argue things like why it's not the fault of the child, for example, that they were part of the 1% in the first place. Most of the efforts come from their parents. So why is it then that they are vicariously liable to the monopolization brought about by their family? And the same goes for government, right? I wish there could have been like more principles to explain why they are vicariously accountable. So they also enjoy the privilege of their parents. The behavior is influenced by the environment they are in, that is built around privilege. And I think like these types of explanation is so important to be able to solidify the responsibility of the state on like whether which kinds of priorities do they want to uphold at the end of the day. Because by then, like with this type of framing, for example, it will just be easy for government to be able to explain that the state has the right or like the power to be able to prevent future generations of oppressors from happening, which is why they want to expose these children as early as now. Or if you are also like agreeing on the fact that these elites, for example, are the most powerful one and they get to influence a lot of policies, for example, that could be like a starting point to prove the tipping point as well, that when we are able to put their children in schools, like they will become more aware on like what is happening in public schools. There will be more incentives for donations, for example, or being able to get involved in like social issues just to ensure that their children also like gets to have the quality education at the end of the day. Like same for opposition, like even if like you're able to prove a lot of pragmatic harms that talk about why these children will be a lot in the losing end, and that even the privileged students who are part of the 1% family gets to experience bullying, for example, and all that. I think that that's just response or like argues for the pragmatic. Given that this is a value judgment debate, I also needed a lot of principle discussions from opposition, aside from the right to parental autonomy, like more on the right of the children to be able to opt out of these kinds of policies for the state that are often harmful and that are often irreversible in terms of like the welfare of the children. So yep, all right, over time. So yep, I think that's the most important general comment, especially that in motion wordings like this, it's very important that you not hyperfixate yourself with the actors that are often consenting. I think that children, for example, in these types of issues also have a right that are also like equally worthy to be discussed at the end of the day. So yep, again, my decision stands even with this general comments. Opposition wins the debate. So for questions to me, just message me on Discord or Messenger for friends. But yep, good luck and hope to see you guys in the breakouts.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.